In the remote village of Rimeford, winter isn't just a season, it's a presence. The fog rolls in thick and heavy, swallowing streets, homes, and people whole. The villagers speak of the fog caller, a spectral figure said to walk the snowy streets when the mist is thickest, whispering secrets that can drive men mad. When Dr. Nathaniel Crane, a rational man of science and skeptic of folklore, arrives in Rimeford to investigate the mysterious disappearances plaguing the village, he quickly realizes that logic holds no power here. The fog isn't just weather, it's alive, and it's watching. The train to Rimeford rattled along icy tracks, slicing through miles of untouched snow-covered wilderness. Outside the frosted window, the sun was sinking below the jagged mountains, casting long, thin shadows across the frozen landscape. Dr. Nathaniel Crane sat stiffly in his seat, his gloved hands gripping a leather satchel filled with papers, notes, and correspondence from the local authorities. He squinted at the village's brief file. Rimeford, population 312. Known for harsh winters and sudden fog formations. 5 disappearances reported in the last month. Witnesses mention hearing whispers in the fog. Nathaniel sighed and snapped the folder shut. He was a man of reason, a man who dealt in facts and evidence, not superstition and folklore, but the villagers' letters had been desperate, their words trembling with fear. The train screeched as it began to slow. Through the window, faint lantern lights flickered in the dense fog that now surrounded the village station. The conductor leaned into the cabin doorway, his face pale under the dim lights. "Rimeford, sir. End of the line." Nathaniel adjusted his scarf, pulled on his overcoat, and stepped off the train. The fog greeted him like a living thing, cold, wet, and thick. It wrapped around his shoulders, clung to his coat, and obscured the faint glow of lanterns hanging along the platform. A man stood waiting near the end of the station, a tall, gaunt figure wrapped in a heavy wool coat and a fur-lined hat. His beard was thick and frost-tipped, and his piercing gray eyes studied Nathaniel carefully. "You must be Dr. Crane," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. Nathaniel extended his hand. "Yes." "And you are?" "Mayor Alistair Poe. Welcome to Rimeford, Doctor. I trust your journey was uneventful." Nathaniel shook his hand. "As uneventful as one can expect on a train into the middle of nowhere." The mayor nodded grimly. "Come, the fog grows heavier at night. It's best to be indoors before then." They walked briskly through the empty village streets. The fog was so thick that Nathaniel could barely make out the shapes of nearby houses, their windows glowing faintly with warm light. "Does it always get this thick?" Nathaniel asked. "Every winter," Alistair replied. "But this year, it's different. It lingers longer, and it whispers." Nathaniel frowned. "You mean people are hearing things in the fog?" The mayor stopped and turned to him. His breath fogged the air as he spoke. "Not things, Doctor. Voices. Voices that know you, that call you by name." Nathaniel stared at him, a chill crawling up his spine. Alistair turned and gestured to a building ahead, a large stone structure with an old wooden sign hanging above the door. The snowbound inn. The inn's interior was warm, though dimly lit by flickering oil lamps and a crackling hearth. A handful of villagers sat hunched at tables, their faces pale and sunken, their eyes darting nervously toward the windows. Alistair led Nathaniel to a table near the fire. "I'll have a room prepared for you, Doctor," Alistair said. "But before the night grows colder, I suggest you speak with old Hester. She was the last to see one of the missing men." "Her nephew." Nathaniel nodded and pulled a small leather notebook from his satchel. "Where can I find her?" Alistair gestured toward a frail-looking woman sitting in the corner of the inn. Her hair was wispy and white, and she clutched a thick shawl around her narrow shoulders. Nathaniel approached cautiously and pulled out a chair. "Mrs. Hester?" Her milky eyes flicked upward, locking onto his. "You're the man from the city," she said softly. "You think you'll make sense of this?" Nathaniel hesitated. "I'll do my best, ma'am." "Can you tell me about your nephew?" About what happened the night he disappeared? Hester's lips trembled as she spoke. He was out fetching wood, just outside our home, barely a dozen paces away. The fog rolled in so fast, thicker than I'd ever seen. And then I heard it. Her voice dropped to a whisper. A voice. From the fog. It said his name. William. It said it the way his mother used to say it, soft and sweet. And then he answered it. He stepped into the fog, and I never saw him again. Nathaniel felt a cold weight settle in his chest. Did you hear anything else? He asked. She nodded slowly, her pale eyes glistening with tears. A giggle, a child's giggle, and then silence. The fire crackled loudly in the silence that followed. Nathaniel stood, his mind racing. Thank you, Mrs. Hester. She caught his hand as he turned to leave. Her grip was surprisingly strong. Doctor, don't go out there at night. Don't follow the voices. Later that night, Nathaniel sat at his desk in the small room Alistair had prepared for him. His notebook lay open, pages filled with scattered observations and half-formed theories. The fog outside pressed against the window, its pale glow seeping through the glass like diluted milk. He glanced at the clock on the wall. 11:57 p.m. The village was silent, too silent. Then faintly, he heard it. A voice. It was soft, barely audible over the crackling fireplace. Nathaniel. He froze. Nathaniel, come outside. Come see. The voice was familiar. It was his mother's voice. He stood slowly, his breath catching in his throat. Nathaniel, I'm waiting. His hand drifted toward the window latch. Outside, the fog churned slowly, like a living thing. A faint shadow moved within it, a tall figure, its outline distorted by the swirling mist. Nathaniel? His fingers grazed the window latch, and then a sharp knock at his door shattered the trance. Doctor. It was Alistair's voice, urgent and trembling. Don't open the window! Don't listen to it! Nathaniel stumbled back from the window, his heart hammering in his chest. The voice outside went silent, but the shadow was still there, pressed against the foggy glass. And though it had no face, Nathaniel could feel it smiling at him. The shadow outside Nathaniel's window lingered, pressed against the glass like an ink blot on pale parchment. It didn't move, didn't breathe, yet Nathaniel felt its presence, felt it watching him. Doctor! Alistair's voice came again, sharp and commanding from the other side of the door. Step away from the window. Nathaniel stumbled backward, his breath sharp and shallow. His boots caught on the rug, and he nearly fell before steadying himself against the edge of the desk. The door burst open, and Mayor Alistair Poe stepped inside, lantern in hand. The golden light sliced through the fog-tinged shadows, but it did little to chase away the oppressive cold that seemed to seep from the window. Alistair's face was pale, his eyes wild with urgency. Were you listening to it? Nathaniel shook his head. It sounded like my mother. It knew her voice. How is that possible? Alistair crossed the room in 2 steps and pulled the heavy curtain shut with a sharp yank. The foggy glow outside disappeared, and with it, so did the shadow. It's always possible in Rimeford, Alistair said grimly. The fog doesn't just roll in. It listens. It learns. And when it speaks, it uses the voices it knows you'll follow. Nathaniel sank into the desk chair, running a trembling hand through his hair. How long has this been happening? The mayor hesitated. As long as I've been alive. Longer, even. There are journals, old records, stories passed down by the elders. But no one talks about it openly. The fog has a way of hearing. Nathaniel frowned. So you're telling me the fog is alive? Alistair sighed and leaned against the door, his lantern flickering. Alive? I don't know. But it remembers, Dr. Crane. It remembers names, faces, regrets. And it doesn't let go. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The faint sound of whispers drifted through the cracks in the window pane, like threads of sound pulled taut across the silence. "Nathaniel?" This time, the voice was faint, distant, but it was still his mother. The next morning dawned pale and weak, with sunlight barely able to break through the heavy blanket of fog clinging to Rimeford. The village square was deserted, the cobblestones slick with frost. Nathaniel wrapped his scarf tighter around his neck as he followed Alistair through the empty streets. "Where are we going?" Nathaniel asked. "To see Father Matthias," Alistair replied. "If anyone knows the true history of this place, it's him." They arrived at an old stone church, its spire vanishing into the swirling fog above. The stained glass windows were cracked and weathered, their colors dulled by time. Inside, the church was dim and cold. Dozens of candles flickered along the altar, casting long shadows across the rows of wooden pews. An elderly man in a heavy black cassock knelt at the altar, his thin lips moving in silent prayer. His head was bald, and the pale light reflected faintly off his scalp. "Father Matthias," Alistair said softly. The old priest rose slowly, his joints creaking with age. His sharp eyes landed on Nathaniel, studying him with suspicion. "So, you're the outsider," Matthias said, his voice a raspy whisper. "The one sent to fix us?" Nathaniel extended a gloved hand. "Dr. Nathaniel Crane, Father. I'm here to help." Matthias ignored the handshake and turned toward the altar. "Help? Doctor, you can no more help us than you can stop the tide. The fog isn't a problem to be solved. It's a hunger to be fed." Nathaniel frowned. "Fed? What do you mean by that?" Matthias gestured to a leather-bound book on the altar. Its spine was cracked, and its pages were yellowed with age. The cover bore an embossed symbol, a circle etched with dozens of jagged lines, resembling a sun with a single unblinking eye in the center. "This is the Codex Tenebris," Matthias said. "It was written centuries ago by the first settlers of Rimeford. They spoke of the Fog Caller, an entity, a being older than our understanding. They believed it lives within the fog, that it needs offerings." Nathaniel's blood ran cold. "Offerings?" Matthias turned his piercing eyes on him. "The missing villagers, Doctor. They were taken. Their voices now whisper in the fog." Nathaniel felt the weight of the codex in his hands as he flipped through its brittle pages. The script was uneven, frantic, and scrawled with ink stains and symbols. One passage caught his eye. "The caller speaks with familiar voices. It promises warmth in the cold, comfort in the dark. But those who follow are forgotten. Their faces fade, their names are swallowed. They become part of it." Night fell heavy and fast over Rimeford. Nathaniel sat in his small inn room, the codex spread out across the desk in front of him. Alistair had retired to his home, and the streets below were empty. But the fog was thicker. It pressed against the windows, against the door, and against Nathaniel's mind. His mother's voice came again, faint and soft. "Nathaniel, come outside. It's so warm here." He clenched his fists, his jaw tight. "No, you're not real. You're not—" A faint knock echoed from the door. Knock, knock, knock. Nathaniel froze. The knock came again, louder this time. He grabbed the lantern from the desk and approached the door cautiously. "Who's there?" he asked, his voice trembling. A child's voice answered him, thin and distant. "Please, help me. I'm lost." Nathaniel hesitated. The voice was so small, so afraid. "Please, it's so cold out here." His hand hovered over the door handle, but then he remembered Hester's warning. "Don't follow the voices. Don't listen." He stepped back. The child's voice stopped. But outside, through the foggy window, he saw a small figure standing in the mist. A child, a little girl with tangled hair and hollow eyes, her nightgown soaked and clinging to her frail frame. She raised one thin hand and pointed directly at him, and then she smiled. It was a grin, wide, jagged, and impossibly sharp. Nathaniel stumbled back, his lantern nearly slipping from his grasp. The fog pressed harder against the window, the child's grin widening until it seemed to split her face in two. And then, she whispered, "It's time, Nathaniel." The glass cracked. The fog poured into the room. The lantern's flame sputtered and died. The whispers became deafening, like a chorus of 1,000 voices speaking at once. And somewhere in that chaos, in the biting cold and churning mist, Nathaniel heard one final voice, clear and sharp. "Come to the heart of the fog, Nathaniel. We're waiting." The fog consumed everything. Nathaniel stumbled backward as the freezing mist poured through the shattered window, snuffing out the faint warmth left by the dying lantern. His breath came in sharp, panicked gasps, visible in the thin moonlight filtering through the broken glass. The child's face, the grinning face, was gone. The window was now an empty, jagged wound in the wall, with fog curling inward like ghostly fingers. The whispers rose, faint but persistent. "Nathaniel. Nathaniel. Come outside." The voice had changed. It wasn't his mother anymore. It wasn't the child. It was something else. Ancient. Hungry. Nathaniel stumbled away from the window, grabbing the Codex Tenebris from the desk and clutching it to his chest. He needed to leave. Now. The hallway outside his room was deathly silent. The fog had crept under the doors and through the cracks in the walls, coiling around Nathaniel's boots as he walked. Every step was met with an agonizing creak of the old wooden floorboards, and every shadow seemed to twitch at the edges of his vision. He reached the stairs and froze. At the bottom stood a figure cloaked in fog. It was tall, impossibly thin, and its features were obscured by the shifting mist that surrounded it. But Nathaniel could see its outline, and at its center, its face, there was a faint, unnatural smile. The figure raised one hand and pointed toward the door. "Come, Nathaniel. We've been waiting." Nathaniel turned and bolted down the opposite hallway. He burst through a side door and out into the freezing night air. The fog hung thick around him, swallowing the faint lanterns that lined the village streets. The cobblestones were slick with frost, and the sound of his boots echoed far too loudly. The church spire loomed faintly in the distance. "Father Matthias," Nathaniel gasped under his breath. "He'll know what to do." He ran, his coat flapping behind him, the codex clutched tightly against his chest. The whispers followed, soft, distant, but ever present. "You can't run, Nathaniel. We're already inside your head." The heavy wooden doors of the church groaned as Nathaniel shoved them open. Inside, dozens of candles flickered along the stone walls, casting faint shadows across the cold floor. "Father Matthias," Nathaniel's voice cracked as he stumbled forward. "Father, are you here?" From the shadows near the altar, the priest emerged, his face pale and drawn. "Dr. Crane," Matthias said softly. "You've seen it, haven't you?" Nathaniel nodded, clutching the codex tighter. "The fog, it's alive. It knows me. It spoke to me, in my mother's voice. It's calling me." Father Matthias approached, his eyes scanning the worn pages of the codex. "Then it's already too late, Doctor. Once it speaks your name, once it knows you, it doesn't stop." Nathaniel's voice trembled. "There must be a way to stop it. The codex, it must have something, some ritual, some answer." Matthias sighed, turning the brittle pages carefully. "There is something. A passage, deep in the codex. It speaks of a place, a sanctum, deep within the fog. The heart." "The heart?" Nathaniel echoed. Matthias nodded. "It is said to be where the fog was born, a rift between our world and something older, something terrible. The settlers built an altar there, a seal to keep it contained, but seals weaken. They always do." Nathaniel's eyes darted across the ancient text Matthias had opened in front of him. There, etched in faded ink, were 3 chilling words. "Beware the caller." Matthias continued, his voice low. "You must go to the heart, Doctor. You must carry the codex with you. You must speak the words, the incantation, to seal the rift once again. Nathaniel felt cold dread pool in his stomach. And if I fail? Matthias met his gaze, his voice hollow. Then Rimeford will be swallowed, and the fog will spread, carrying the whispering caller with it. The village square was empty as Nathaniel stepped into the fog-drenched night, the Codex Tenebris tucked tightly under his arm. Behind him, the bells of the church tolled once, a heavy, hollow sound that reverberated through the fog. He walked forward, lantern in hand, guided by faint memories of the map Matthias had shown him. His boots crunched softly in the frost-covered snow as he made his way toward the outskirts of the village, toward the woods, where the fog was thickest. The whispers grew louder as he walked. "This way, Nathaniel. Come closer. The heart is waiting." Every now and then, faint figures would emerge from the fog, standing motionless between the trees. Their faces were obscured, but he could feel their eyes on him, their smiles. The path narrowed as he entered the forest. The fog pressed tighter, wrapping around his face and shoulders like a damp shroud. The lantern's light barely cut through the swirling mist. Nathaniel began to see symbols etched into the trees, jagged, twisting runes that matched those in the codex. They glowed faintly, pulsing like distant stars. The whispers were relentless now. "Closer. You're almost there. We're waiting." After what felt like hours, Nathaniel stumbled into a clearing. The fog seemed to thin slightly here, revealing an ancient stone altar at the center of the clearing. The surface of the altar was etched with the same symbols from the codex, now glowing faintly in a pale blue light, and beyond the altar, rising out of the mist like an impossible shadow, stood the caller. It was tall. Its form was draped in thick, swirling fog, and its face, if it had one, was obscured by shadows. But at its center, faint and flickering, was an endless grin, a mouth stretched impossibly wide, filled with countless jagged teeth. Its voice vibrated through the clearing, low and resonant. "Nathaniel, you came." Nathaniel's hands shook as he placed the codex on the altar. The caller began to move, gliding forward without sound, without weight, its grin growing wider with every step. Nathaniel fumbled with the codex's pages, his trembling fingers searching desperately for the incantation Matthias had shown him. The fog thickened, the shadows grew longer. "Speak the words, Nathaniel, or be swallowed." His voice cracked as he began to read from the codex, the ancient syllables clawing their way from his throat. The symbols on the altar began to glow brighter, the pale light spreading outward in jagged veins across the frozen ground. The caller stopped, its form flickering and trembling. Nathaniel's voice rose above the whispers, his words sharp, clear, and commanding. The fog began to scream. The caller's grin twisted into something almost angry, its form shuddering and collapsing inward as the light from the altar intensified. The fog recoiled, swirling upward like a reverse waterfall, pulled into the gaping maw of the altar. Nathaniel screamed the final word of the incantation. And then, silence. The clearing was empty. The fog was gone. The air was still, cold and clear. The moon hung low in the sky, casting faint light over the ruins of the altar. Nathaniel fell to his knees, the codex still clutched in his trembling hands. It was over, or so he thought, because somewhere, faint and distant, carried on the thin winter wind, came a voice, soft, whimsical. "Nathaniel, we'll meet again." The silence in the clearing was oppressive, as though the very air had been drained of sound. Nathaniel knelt beside the crumbling altar, his breath fogging faintly in the cold air. The Codex Tenebris lay open on the stone, its pages trembling slightly in the weak wind that drifted across the clearing. The fog was gone. For the first time since arriving in Rimeford, Nathaniel could see the stars, sharp and distant against the velvet black sky. But the voice, that faint, distant whisper, still echoed in his mind. "Nathaniel, we'll meet again." His knees buckled as he tried to stand, exhaustion clawing at his bones. His hands shook as he clutched the codex to his chest, its brittle pages pressing against his racing heart. It was over. At least, that's what he told himself. The walk back to Rimeford felt endless. The woods were quiet, unnaturally still. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if some unseen weight pressed down on his shoulders. When he finally emerged from the tree line and stumbled into the village square, dawn was breaking. Faint streaks of pale gold pierced the horizon, illuminating the frost-covered rooftops. But something was wrong. The village was silent. No distant chatter from waking families. No crackle of fireplaces or smell of breakfast drifting on the breeze. The doors of the snowbound inn hung slightly ajar, creaking softly in the wind. "Hello?" Nathaniel called out, his voice barely rising above a whisper. No reply. The square was empty. The fog was gone, yes, but so were the people. Nathaniel stepped cautiously into the inn. The dining area was deserted, the chairs overturned, plates shattered on the floor. A faint layer of frost had crept across the windows. "Alistair? Hester? Anyone?" His voice echoed faintly in the stillness. On one of the tables lay a scrap of parchment, hastily scrawled in ink that had begun to freeze. We heard it again. The caller. "The fog is gone, but it's still here. It's inside us now. Run, Doctor, before it finds you too." Nathaniel's heart slammed against his ribs. He turned and bolted back out into the square. The church bells tolled once, sharp and resonant. Nathaniel's head snapped toward the sound. The ancient stone church stood at the edge of the square, its spire reaching into the pale morning sky. The door was open. Faint candlelight flickered inside. With trembling steps, Nathaniel crossed the square and pushed open the heavy wooden door. Inside, Father Matthias knelt at the altar, his head bowed low, his lips moving in silent prayer. The codex felt heavier in Nathaniel's hands as he approached. "Father Matthias," Nathaniel said softly. The priest didn't respond. "Father?" Nathaniel reached out and touched the old man's shoulder. Matthias toppled sideways, his body hitting the cold stone floor with a dull thud. His eyes were open, wide and glassy, and his mouth was stretched into an unnatural grin. Frozen, silent, dead. Nathaniel stumbled backward, bile rising in his throat. "Dear God." But there was no God here, only silence. And then, a sound. A faint giggle, echoing somewhere deep in the shadows of the church. Sharp. Hollow. Nathaniel turned toward the sound, his lantern trembling in his grip. From the far end of the church, near the rows of empty pews, a figure began to emerge from the shadows. It was a child, a little girl in a white nightgown, her hair hanging in damp strands over her pale face. Her hollow eyes stared directly at Nathaniel, and her lips slowly curled into an impossibly wide grin. "Nathaniel?" the girl whispered. Nathaniel took a step back. No, this isn't real. You're not real." The girl's grin stretched wider, her teeth sharp and yellowed. "You let us out, Nathaniel," she said softly. "You broke the seal, and now we're free." The shadows behind her began to move. More figures stepped forward, dozens of them. Men, women, children, all pale, all grinning, their hollow eyes fixed on Nathaniel. The air in the church grew colder. The candles flickered violently, their flames shrinking into faint embers. Nathaniel stumbled back toward the door, his lantern swinging wildly in his hand. "You can't stop us now," the girl said, her voice overlapping with the whispers of 1,000 other voices. Nathaniel turned and ran. The village square was bathed in pale light as Nathaniel burst out of the church, gasping for breath. But the fog had returned. It wasn't rolling in from the woods, it was seeping up from the ground. Thin tendrils of mist curled over the cobblestones, coiling up the sides of buildings and wrapping around lampposts. The whispers began again. "Nathaniel, come back. Nathaniel, come see." He had failed. The ritual hadn't worked. The fog had changed. It was no longer confined to the forest or the altar. It was everywhere. Nathaniel ran blindly through the village, past frozen doorways and hollow windows. The fog closed in around him, thick and suffocating. He could hear them, the grins in the mist, their voices, their laughter. He stumbled and fell into the snow, his lantern breaking beside him. The faint flame sputtered and died. From the mist emerged the girl in the nightgown. She knelt beside him, her hollow eyes inches from his own. "You can't run from us, Nathaniel," she whispered. Her grin split her face in two, stretching so wide it seemed to tear at the corners of her mouth. Not anymore. The fog rose higher, swirling around Nathaniel, closing over his face, his mouth, his eyes. He screamed, but no sound came out. The fog stole his voice. And then it was silent. The village of Rimeford was abandoned. The fog still hung low over the crooked rooftops and frozen cobblestones. The snow had piled up in the square, untouched by footsteps or the sound of life. The church bell no longer tolled. In the stillness of the fog, faint shadows moved, figures standing motionless in the mist, their hollow eyes watching, their faint smiles frozen in place. And somewhere, deep in the swirling fog, a voice whispered. Soft, sweet, familiar. "Nathaniel, we're still here?" The fog rippled, a faint giggle echoing through the silence. And then stillness. The fog waited, and it whispered,